with our first session. I want to welcome you to the session on parties, politics, and polarization. Our keynote speaker is Nick Valentino, who is the Donald R. Kinder Collegiate Professor of Political Science and a research professor in the Center for Political Studies here at the University of Michigan. He is also the principal investigator of the American National Election Studies. His work focuses on political psychological approaches to understanding public opinion formation, socialization, information seeking, and electoral participation. He is joined on this panel by Allison Harell, professor of political science at the University of Quebec at Montreal. She is the co-director of the Consortium on Electoral Democracy, and her work focuses on how social diversity affects the political world, especially the ways in which prejudice influences public opinion formation. I'm going to turn the session over to Ariel Hasell, the moderator, who is an assistant professor of communication and media at the University of Michigan, as well as a faculty associate in the Center for Political Studies. Broadly speaking, her research focuses on digital media, public opinion, and public engagement with politics and science. She's interested in the ways an individual's choice of news media content influences various attitudes and behaviors, including information evaluation, motivations to process and share information, and the formation of policy preferences. Ariel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. Given we're running a little bit behind, I'm just going to give it right away to Nick to get going.
Thank you, Ariel, and thank you, Mike. This is a very big honor for me. The comments that Bob made, many of the comments that Bob made resonated with me very much. I'm not of that generation, but when I started here in 1997, I remember very distinctly Mike Traugott walked over to my office in the communication department and said, "Are you going to the Miller Converse lecture?" It was one of the first Miller Converse lectures. And I said, "Of course I am." And we walked from our department back here to our offices here and talked about how excited we were to hear the Miller Converse lecture, which had just gotten started. And so many of the sort of historical points that Bob made really resonate with me now. There's also a couple of other things I'm really grateful for within Bob's comments. One is the reminder to all of you about the proper pronunciation of Rensis Lickert's last name. I tell my students this every year and they just disregard it and don't believe it. Maybe if they heard Bob's talk, they will believe that. And the other really small but important point that Bob mentioned is that, and I didn't know that Angus Campbell had said this, which is that the entire institute is always 6 months away from bankruptcy. And then he said, but it's been that way for many years. And that was both, of course, terrifying in the present moment, but also very reassuring in some respects. So I have many other people to thank, but my time is limited. And I also want to give my dear colleague, Allison Harell, her time. So I have two goals here for you in the first discussion of the day. One is to revisit the specific history of the American National Election Study as we celebrate as a study our 75th anniversary as well, fortuitously. At least that's how we're calling our study 75 years as well. The first study was performed in 1948, and there's some discussion about whether we should be somehow this should be the 76th anniversary, but that's not a nice round number. So we're going to share, and so my first goal is to share with you a few points of important history for the project, and my second goal is to show you how that history informs and facilitates some of the research that we can do as a part of the vision of those founders, making good on, I think, some of the promise and some of the vision of the founders that Bob mentioned in his discussion. Oh, we have this clicker here, huh? Very good. So first of all, you'll see here some of the faces that you saw earlier. Here's Angus Campbell, Donald Stokes, Warren Miller, and Phil Converse at a young age, who wrote the American Voter that Bob mentioned at the beginning. And their first study that they put together was in 1948. That was run by Angus Campbell. Its purpose was not to more accurately predict the outcome of the 1948 presidential election between Truman and Dewey, but they did more accurately predict the outcome of that election than any other poll being done at the time. The early polling was heavily based on quota sampling methods, which produced a prediction of a landslide for Dewey, as you may remember. And the early 600 or so, 550 area-based sample that was produced by Angus and Katz was much more accurate and predicted a very close, in fact, close election that actually occurred. This is the foundation, really, this 1948 study of what we now call the ANES. And that's why we're saying that we're 75. But really the development and the expansion of the project was done in collaboration with these other scholars. And they began what was called the Michigan election study from 1952 to 1976. The Michigan election study was a face-to-face, two-wave national sample, area-based sample, which got very high response rates and which was able to fundamentally change the way people study politics and American politics in particular. Professor Harell will describe how that study has affected the study of politics in other democracies, which I think is one of its great legacies and was fully envisioned and intended by this group. But one of the really important things I just want to mention, and it's outlined, I think, beautifully in an essay that Nancy Burns, former director of the Center for Political Studies, as well as PI of the American National Election Study and chair of our Department in Political Science, she lays out in a beautiful essay on the study that their idea was not just to describe what was happening in each election as it occurred and to try to understand the issues of the day, not just that. In fact, their idea was to create a legacy for the future of both consistent measurement and high quality sampling that would allow us to understand change in public opinion in democracies over time. And this consistency and measurement innovation is really, I think, at the core and is a hallmark of the American National Election Study that makes it very unique. So here's a slide that it has way too much information on it, but it's outlining some of the changes over time and how the election study has been funded. We were first not funded by the NSF, then we became partially funded by the NSF. In the late 70s, we became fully funded by the NSF, and we've been so ever since. And we've also become much more interdisciplinary and diverse in both the people who run the study, the institutions that run it, as well as the people involved. And one of the things I'm most proud of, I joined right around here, PIs like Professor Lupia handed off to PIs like Vince Hutchings and Ted Brader, and then to me and to others. But those are just the Michigan PIs. We now have PIs at Stanford, including Shanto Iyengar, at Duke, including Sunshine Hilligus, and at Texas, including Darren Shaw. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that the National Science Foundation has always had in the back of their mind, I believe, that the appropriate view of the ANES, which is that we are an infrastructure project, a national resource for people studying politics, not just a study for political scientists. And they've now institutionalized this in the Research Infrastructure for the Social and Behavioral Sciences Directorate. This is a new directorate which starts with what we refer to as the big three: the panel study of income dynamics, the general social survey, and the American National Election Study. I say starts very intentionally. I think if Lee Walker were here, he would say, Yes, we're just starting with those three projects, but this is a really important innovation because those projects are, as you can tell by their names, come from very different intellectual backgrounds, and yet they are all infrastructure projects. So now I think that gives us hope that maybe Angus Campbell's, the concern side of Angus Campbell's prognostication that we're always 6 months away from defunding is no longer something we need to worry about, at least not every day. Just very quickly, and I hope that this isn't, I hope that this is obvious to many of you who've used the data, but I want to make sure that you know our principles are four. We have four major principles that we attempt to follow, and I think all the PIs throughout the history of the project have, whether they acknowledge it or not, intend to follow this. The first is public value. The fact that these early studies were not funded nationally or by taxpayer dollars, but were nearly immediately put into the public domain for use by all scholars who were interested in analyzing politics. That means that the PIs were using their own money and giving the data to everyone. And soon the National Science Foundation was funding the project, and we continue to do this. So this is public value, data that can answer important questions for the user community, the intellectual community at large. And we consider that to be as large as possible an intellectual community. The second is that we have data quality, and that is not simply the result of innovations like one of Bob Groves's most central contributions to the field, which is the idea of total sampling, total survey error, minimizing that, of course, but also to think about the very many different intellectual projects that are drawn from and used by the sample, by the community. One of the things I wasn't reading my notes, and it's terrible to read your notes anyway in these kinds of talks, but the numbers, the statistics on the impact of the data in terms of publications, dissertations, journalistic articles, and other uses of the data set is pretty stunning. And as one of the caretakers of the current caretakers of the project, makes me the proudest to be somebody that helps to generate so much scholarly output that we, the PIs, had nothing really directly to do with. It's not our projects, not our products. That's what fitness for use means. Of course, that's a very daunting definition of fitness for use, right? We are not in the business of predicting the current presidential election outcome, thank goodness. Thank goodness, thank goodness, thank goodness. If you asked us to do that, we would have just as much trouble as everybody else, to be very honest. We have very high response rates relative to everyone else. We think we need to do somewhat less post-adjustment weighting than everyone else. We think we're doing just what Groves wants us to do with regard to building very complex sampling designs with many different approaches that allow us this kind of package of deliverables, none of which is perfect on its own, but together can produce data that everybody can count on and can rely on. But still, we cannot tell you who's going to win the current presidential election. So I'm taking that off the table as one of the questions you might ask us later, unless Allison would like to take that, but she's not currently employed or working or studying this country, and so I don't think that'd be fair either. Inclusivity is just a different way of saying what I said first, which is public value. High data quality and high sampling quality and care about measurement and consistency over time. This doesn't help if we don't maximize the size and the diversity of our user community, not just in the scholarly community, but also in high schools and in journalistic circles. We want these data to be used, and so we think a lot about how we can try to do that. And lastly, and very importantly, transparency. We have to be honest about how we are collecting our data and building our samples so that we can be both, so that we can improve via feedback from the community, and so that, so that we know when we're wrong and why we were wrong. And one of the difficulties with collaborating, as you may all know, as scholars who try to collaborate across different methodologies is that it's hard without a specific, very careful delineation of how you got the data that you are using to try to convince me of an argument to move forward with that collaboration. So transparency, obviously, very key. Data deliverables. We have innovations from the past, and one of the ones I'm going to skim very quickly through this slide, one of the ones that was very early on taken seriously is the notion that occasionally we have to interview people more than once. We have to interview people over time. And I think the American National Election Study has done that in really several moments around this period of time, but also around the time of the Watergate scandal, around the time of the attacks of September 11th from 2000 to 2004, and now again in the beginning of and the following through on a plan for panel data beginning in 2016 through 2020 and to 2024. That one of the projects we're going to deliver early in the spring is a panel of at least 2,000 individuals asked the same questions in 3 different presidential elections, the first time the American National Election Study has ever done this. So you can see now that we are taking the legacies that the founders hoped we would take seriously. We are taking those very seriously and trying to follow through. You can see that these are just some of the separate samples we're going to try to deliver in 2024. So this actually is what keeps me up at night, is that there's too many moving, I'm revealing too much. There's many moving parts. There's many moving parts. There are many samples. And these samples have different sampling characteristics. This is, again, this is part of the packaging and the bundling of different strengths and weaknesses that Groves was talking about earlier. We're doing this with a fresh face-to-face sample, probability sample. This is the traditional sample pre and post. We have a fresh online address-based sample with design character, high strength, high value design characteristics, maybe even smaller design effects than the face-to-face, but the face-to-face gets us individuals who will not answer survey, web-based surveys. We have this separate panel design, which is getting north of 90% re-interview rates. So that's better than 7% response rates, very high re-interview rates. We have a social media panel study, which asks people from 2020 to 2024 about their media behavior and actually can track their media behavior when Meta used to speak with social scientists in a productive way, hoping they will again someday soon. We have a spouse partner survey going on where the partner of the person interviewed in the web or the face-to-face samples, these 2 samples here, is being asked to fill out a brief survey to talk about their work so that we can look at individual household homophily with regard to politics. And finally, we have this fantastic collaboration with the General Social Survey where 900 respondents from the social survey over the summer, 900 of their respondents over the summer will answer and are answering the entire ANES pre and post-election surveys in the fall. So we'll have all that rich sociological data from the General Social Survey respondents. This is essentially a panel, but we're asking them different questions, political questions that we can now use to merge and link these 2 data sets. We're terribly excited about this. For those who are working on the panel study for income dynamics in the audience, know that we are coming for you next, and we hope that we can also fulfill a promise of collaboration across our 2 great studies as well. So these are the innovations, the deliverables. We're very excited about it. Terrified and excited are 2 very similar emotions. I study emotion, but we're really excited. And here's the deliverables for over time. This is what we're so proud of and what we promised we were gonna, what Angus Campbell and Warren Miller and the others, Phil Converse, Donald Stokes, were hoping that the American National Election Study could someday become. And that is that we could track using very similar, in this case, identical methodology, measurement methodology over time, changes in the American political landscape. Here is just percentages of the American electorate that identify as Democrats in blue Independents in red, forgive me for the miscoloring the lines, Republican in yellow. For those of you who really know your stuff, we're including leaners in the question. I'm not going to get into the details about what that means. But you can see a declining number, secular decline in the number of Americans who identify as Democrats, a small matching secular increase in over time since 1952 in the percentage of people who identify as Republicans, and a fairly stable percentage between 10 and 15% usually of people who insist that they are independent. So even if you don't know these data, you can now leave this talk with at least one piece of evidence that everyone is not an independent and that partisanship is becoming much more evenly matched in our society than it was prior to about 1980. Another thing that you could take away from this, this is sad and maybe scary. Another thing you could take away from this talk is, as a result of the legacy of the American National Election Study, is that Americans are much less trusting in government over time, and that does not appear to be a temporary shift. The methodology that we use for these are questions that we consistently ask, like, how often can you trust the federal government in Washington to do what's right? Do you think that quite a few of the people running the government are crooked? Not very many are crooked? Or do you think hardly any of them are crooked? Obviously, that one is flipped in this graph. Do you think that people in government waste a lot of the money we pay in taxes, waste some of it, or don't waste much of it? Would you say that the government is pretty much run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, or is that or that it is run for the benefit of the people? And in each case, that secular, with some perhaps explainable deviations during periods of massive economic expansion, or in reaction perhaps to the 9/11 attacks, but beyond those kinds of bumps, we see a secular decline. The Watergate scandal didn't do us any favors as a polity. Is this just one party or the other, or independent people who call themselves independents? No. This is both parties. This is independents. This is all of us. So we trust government much less. Trust in government is an important, in democracies, it turns out, trust that your institutions of government are going to do the right thing and will solve problems fairly and will make decisions based on what's best for the majority of Americans, not just for small select groups, wealthy groups. Many democratic theorists believe this is an important part of what maintains democratic institutions in the first place and maintains our ability for our institutions to live on. So these are sources of concern. Another really interesting thing that the ANES allows us to do is to look at the strength of partisanship. So as our trust in government has declined, the strength of our partisanship has increased. I have two, you can all produce this graphic in about 5 seconds, I think, or maybe 10 seconds if you go to the American National Election Study website and fool around with some of the data visualizations, thanks to Sang-Jung Han, who I believe is in the audience. He's right there. He helped us he produced this. Let's just give him full credit. So we have two trends here. One, the darker line is the weak partisans. You can see that weak partisans are on the decline over time and strong partisans are on the increase. And very recently, in 2020, we have this massive spike in people calling themselves strong partisans. Again, is this just Democrats or just Republicans? No, this is everyone. Much stronger partisans. This is one of those firehouse moments that sometimes we think something very different is happening now. And we can say something is different is happening because the measurement is the same. This is not an instrumentation problem. What is happening here? Notice that it's not starting in 2016, in case that was your explanation, although it does really jump in 2020. And of course, another big major source of concern and interest among scholars, not just in political science, but I think now in many fields of social science, is what's referred to as affective polarization, the dislike of the out-group by the in-group in American politics, the dislike of the negative affect toward the out party among members of the in party. Is this just a Democratic trend or a Republican trend? No. Democrats think highly of themselves pretty persistently over time. Republicans think highly of themselves pretty persistently over time. They both don't think much of the other guys. And we start in 1980. We see some difference, of course, is natural and to be expected. You wouldn't expect the people to like the outgroup that much. Actually, if we take the time series back further, you'll see they did like the outgroup more than they do here. And now they don't like the outgroup very much at all. Shanto Iyengar was not only a co-PI of mine, but also one of my dissertation advisors, has done studies where one of the shocking things that you can get from the American National Election Study is data that shows that the number of people who place the out party at 0 on a feeling thermometer, 0 out of 100, has more than quadrupled over the last several studies. Something is going on here. So I don't have exactly at what time do I need to step off of the podium? 10 more minutes, okay. Not enough to get into all the details of an example of my own work that uses the American National Election Study. So I'll move quickly, and maybe if you have questions as it blows by you very quickly, you can ask in the question and answer period. So we're thinking about this problem that we just showed you here, and the question is why? Why is this happening? And Harell and I have one answer, but there are many answers actually currently on the table. And almost all of them attempt to answer the question using American National Election Study data, maybe all of them. One is that people just disagree more than they used to about issues, or that their ideology has gotten more extremely polarized. They just are more liberal or more conservative. The parties have sorted along ideology, or in particular along issues that divide the country. Another argument is that our media has changed. The source of our information has changed. It's gotten much more negative and caustic, much more toxic. Social media hasn't helped because it's allowed people to silo themselves into very distinct information sources where they don't listen across lines of difference and they never hear how reasonable the other's arguments are. Another is that the way we've sorted actually is to those who we've sorted into two partisan groups, one who is very morally certain and one group that is less morally certain. Moral certitude is a less important part of their personality. I'll leave it to you to guess about which party is which there. And obviously these are not exactly mutually exclusive and may in fact be simultaneously correct to some extent or causally ordered. And that gets to what I think are the most convincing arguments. One is by Lily Mason, which says that we've sorted socially on many dimensions at the same time. We've sorted on race. As we've sorted into parties, we've sorted on race. We've sorted on ideology. We've sorted on religion and religiosity. And we've sorted maybe even on class and income. And as we've sorted into these opposing groups, the out party is different from us on more and more social dimensions, which explains why we like them less, because they're different from us, not just in one way, but in every way socially. That's a very important argument, and it's extremely impactful. And Lily is someone who very much values ANES data. Harell and I, as well as others, and this is I think a very important book that just came out by a person named Neil O'Brien. He's now at Oregon, who makes this argument very beautifully in an APD kind of, mostly APD, but also uses ANES data as well, to say that really what's driving all of this, what Lily finds, is this. and this is the controversial part of my argument, which is that the racial argument, the racial sorting and racial attitudinal differences are what drive most of what the other things that we see and that Lily claims are at the heart of partisan affective polarization. So again, Lily and her colleagues, her adherents say that the growing alignment between partisanship and a whole set of social identities, including race, religion, class, all of these things produce affective polarization. It's rooted in social identity theory. So if the outgroup is different than you on multiple dimensions, it's going to be harder for you to like that group. And as the number of dimensions multiplies, the less you will like that outgroup, the more threatening they will get. The assumptions that she and others make are, I think, one time I was giving a talk and Lily was giving a talk in a different part of the university I was visiting. And she heard I was giving a talk about this project and she came running down in the middle of her talk to say, why are you talking about me behind my back? And we were both from different universities, so there was no way I would have been able to know she was there. I hope she's not here now. Lily, are you here? So sorting on all social dimensions occurred simultaneously. That is, secularly, we all drifted apart on all these dimensions. Public perceptions of the party coalitions are common knowledge and vary little across citizens. We all know that the Democratic Party has gotten less white. We all know that the Republican Party is very white. That's an assumption. But also that they're wealthier or that they are more religious or also that they're more conservative. And that all of these dimensions are equally influential in predicting dislike of the out party. Now, on their face, I think some of these things would be challenging for political scientists and as well as other survey scientists to accept, simply because we know, for example, assumption 2 is very rarely true, that there's almost nothing that's common knowledge, first of all, and that things vary across individuals a lot. So there's variance in the perceptions of the out party. And there's variance in all of these dimensions, in fact. But it is true that racially the parties have sorted. So here we have 3 panels that show that whites as a share of the Democratic Party has decreased substantially since 1950. This is again using the ANES data, self-identified race, self-identified party. And the share of African Americans as a proportion of the party has increased over that period. And that decrease is steeper than the decrease in all voters. Our society has gotten more diverse over time, so it would be not surprising if the party shift was equal to the shift in all voters, but it's not. It's more significant. And among Republicans, that line is less steep than the line among all voters. So in fact, we have become, our impressions maybe in this room about the party's shifts in demographics, racial demographics, are true. Now how much time, Ariel? No time? 5 minutes, great. Okay, and furthermore, the increase in the number of non-whites, but in this case it's African Americans in particular, as a share of the party, this increase is steeper than the share in the electorate, and it doesn't change that way among Republicans. So the party has gotten, the Republican Party has gotten more white relative to the population, and the Democratic Party has gotten less white relative to the population over this period. Does that mean that this is the cause of our polarization problem? No. There are other things that have changed too. This is the same more or less information now for 4 different dimensions that Mason in the sorting theory talks about. The religious dimension here is the percentage of each party that is Christian. And again, we have Democrats, Republicans are pluses and Democrats are X's. But the main point is that they're very similar. The population has gotten less Christian and the parties have gotten less Christian, but about equally. Income has changed a bit, but not very much. Doesn't look like the pattern that we see for the polarization graph I showed you. Ideology, on the other hand, changes dramatically. So if I had more time, I would hand wring with you how we are going to show, using these kinds of historical data, that what's happening here is because of race and not because of changes in ideology in the parties, which is a big debate currently in the field. I'm going to argue that that race dragged ideology along and not the other way around. If you look at the bivariate relationships between sorting, so this is each year now is its own case in a regression analysis that allows us to fit a line through all of the American national election studies over time, and you can see that by their date. This is, again, the vision. Hopefully, we're not abusing the legacy of the American election studies too much, but the vision of the founders was that someday there'd be enough data that we could look back across all of the election studies and do comparative statics for all of these elections. This is an example of that. You can see that as the proportion of whites in each party changes and becomes larger, so does affective polarization, and those years are very tightly aligned on that fairly steep line. There's the regression coefficient, the bivariate regression coefficient down below. But we also have religion and ideology keeping pace. Again, not income, but religion and ideology. I'm going to move on very quickly because I know that I'm running out of time. But one thing I want you to know is with regard to religion, most of the data are clustered down here in the lower left quadrant, which means if we don't consider the years following 2000, we're going to have a cloud of data. And if I showed you that, which I have, but I'm not going to show you, the regression line is basically flat. So again, I'm arguing that race drags other things along. Race drags religiosity or Christianity along as a driver of affective polarization and as a driver of the differences we see between the groups. But I'm not going to be able to do that with ideology because there is a line and a distribution of years that looks a lot like race. If we're right and affect about groups is increasingly tied to party affect, then we should see this. We should see that as Black affect is more and more positive year on year, people should like the Democratic Party more. And as white affect is more positive, we should see people liking the Republican Party more. And we do see that. I don't have 2020 in here, forgive me, but it doesn't change anything. And the last thing I'll say, just because I'm sure that you're not convinced, actually, I'm quite sure you're not convinced yet, but is another piece of circumstantial evidence, which is that if we compare issues that we've asked in the American National Election Study for many, many years, 30 or more years, in almost exactly the same way, and we see how well positions on those issues, or in this case, racial attitudes, predicts affective polarization, we'll see that racial resentment is the winner in this particular comparison. We have consistent measurement on abortion. We do see that as you become more conservative on abortion, more pro-life, affective polarization does increase. Almost no effect for defense spending, but a big, big change for racial resentment. That is, the more racially conservative you are, the bigger your affective polarization, the less you like the out party. The less racially resentful you are, the more you like the Democrats. Okay? General conclusions are that we are probably a lot closer to finding the answer to this because of the American National Election Study, but that doesn't mean we're there yet, and we need everybody else, including people in this room, to keep working on this. I'm very grateful to be one of the caretakers of this project because I don't think we would have gotten as far as we have without it. And with that, I'll just say thank you, and I have some more people to thank here and here and here. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So first of all, I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. I'm one of those 25,000 people that have come through here. During my graduate school, I did a summer school at ICPSR. So it's fun to be back here at this stage in my career as well. The mandate that I was given was to talk about the ANES in comparative perspective. And so I'm coming to this from the perspective of the Canadian Election Study. I'm one of the co-PIs on that project since 2019. So I'm going to talk about the comparative impact of the ANES, partly as something that has had lots of spillover into other national election studies. And I just one of the expressions that Nick used a few times in his talk was this idea that he's the caretaker of the ANES. And I think that's something that you see repeated a lot in national election studies across the world, because what we're doing is really a public service to the research community to provide openly accessible information. I think that's really at the heart of what ISR does. And so that's part of the reason that I'm really excited to share this presentation with you. We'll see if I can move my slides. So I'd like to start with a quote by John Miso, who was one of the PIs on the very first Canadian election study. And there's a shout out to Michigan and Ann Arbor in here, so I was really proud to find this. So in a retrospective of that first Canadian election study, John Miso says, "It was essential, I believe, that the Canadian survey be done in a manner echoing some of the past blazed by Angus Miller, Philip Converse, Warren Miller, and Donald Stokes at the University of Michigan, then the platinum standard, and I'd say today the platinum standard, in electoral surveys, and that our work should provide material comparative with that generated at Ann Arbor and the various European studies following its general approach." So 1965. The 1965 study was actually conducted in collaboration with Phil Converse and some other scholars in the Canadian context, and it wasn't the only place that we saw the proliferation in French of national election studies across the world. So you had a whole series of national election studies, as reported by Larry Leduc, that were going on in the 1960s as the CES was being fielded, as the ANES was becoming an institution of the study of electoral behavior. And in Canada, we also have a long history, and echoing some of the things that Nick said in his presentation, of a constantly running Canadian election study that really tries to track some of the fundamental predictors of electoral behavior. So it started in 1965 with John Miso and Phil Converse and Pinard and Regenstreich and Schwartz. I'll note we did have a woman in our very first Canadian election study, Mildred Schwartz, sort of a pillar in Canadian political behavior studies who focused on the regional dynamics in the Canadian context. One of the only election we haven't run was in 1972, which speaks to the difficulty in funding national election studies. And so this idea that you're always 6 months away from bankruptcy is something that we feel acutely in the Canadian context, and is something that actually is really important in terms of how this study has developed over time. That very first study, to give you a little bit of a historical context, also has other connections to the University of Michigan, and what eventually becomes ISR. So the 1965 study, John Miso reports that he figured it would cost about $50,000, which seems like not so much today, but it was a lot at the time. And the Canada Council, which was the funding agency that he used at the time, gave its biggest grant ever. $25,000 was by far the biggest grant they had ever given to a social scientist at the time. To fund the study. He was denied at first, and they decided eventually to give him the money. And it was also funded by the Barbeau Commission on Electoral Expenses, which is also something that's reflected in the way in which the Canadian election study has been funded over time. Over the course of the CES longitudinal data set, we've almost always had partners with electoral institutions in the Canadian context, which is something that is very different from in the US context. And then some charitable money, as well as $5,000 from the University of Michigan, which helped us get our election study off the ground, as well as Queen's University, where John Miso was based. I think the funding is important to think about in terms of the way in which the ANES is funded, but also the ways in which other national election studies have modeled off of this type of funding dynamic. And also, I think it's something critical to think about when we're talking about being able to have resources like the ANES and resources like comparative election studies that we can use and compare and contrast across these contexts. In the Canadian context, our equivalent of NSF is SSHRC, which is our main research funding agency. Gives a lot less than the SF does in terms of the institutionalization of the ANES in the US context, as well as government agency funds, and notably Elections Canada, who's been a really important partner in funding the election study. And I'll note that in 1965, one of the reasons the Electoral Commission gave money to John Miso is because he agreed to put questions on there for the Electoral Commission, which is the same thing that's been happening with Elections Canada over the course of the CES funding cycle. We provide information about electorals' confidence in the electoral process for them. And since 2019, we've been funded by a partnership grant, which is a direct collaboration with government agencies and electoral management bodies, as well as civil society actors. and have changed the motto to much more research buy-in by the research community. So we actually sell modules to help pay for the cost of the funding. Why am I telling you all of that? Partly because I think the ways in which national election studies are funded in Canada and elsewhere, you can see a lot of the same tensions that I think the NES and other electoral studies face in terms of creating a public good, a resource that not just the researchers who are conducting the study can take advantage of, but all of these multiple other users, be it graduate students, be it other researchers across the community and different end users. The CES has developed some innovations that reflect a lot of the developments that you see over time being developed in the ANES as well. It began as a post-election survey. In 1988, there was the development of the growing cross-section by Dick Johnston and collaborators on those studies. And we had a 3-wave Canadian election study, pre and post, with an additional mailback to get some additional information. And it's shifted over time to the web, which is something that you also see in the ANES context. In 2015 was the first time we had a web wave to the Canadian election study. And over the last 2 election cycles in the CESs that I've been involved in, we've run parallel studies web and online, and we've transitioned to all online in this last 2021 Canadian election, and we will in hopefully not 2024, hopefully in 2025 for the next Canadian federal election. One of the things that we've also added, which I think is interesting, is that we've also added provincial studies for every provincial election that's happened over the last few years in Canada, as well as non-election year surveys. So we've amassed a whole lot of data that can be used to track some of the same types of trends that we're seeing in the US. One of the things I hope you take away, and I hope I convince you, I won't convince you of everything, but I hope I convince you that the ANES and the CES have been in an intellectual and methodological conversation over the entire course of their history. And I think one of the major themes that really have been drawn from the comparison of ANES and CES data are really around the themes of partisanship and polarization. So the very original 1965 CES was essentially a replica of the early ANES studies, asking questions about partisan identity and the ways in which political objects in the Canadian context were perceived by electors. There were early comparisons of partisanship in the Canadian context and questions about what that would tell us about partisanship as a theoretical concept that helps us explain electoral behavior. One of the concerns of the early authors of the CES was that partisanship actually was too predictive in Canada in comparison to the US. And so unlike a lot of European election studies that left partisanship aside in multi-party contexts, in the Canadian context, it's really been a core question of interest. So early concerns that partisanship was too correlated with vote. Over the course of the 80s, we had the development of the concept of durable and flexible partisans by Clark and colleagues, as well as concerns about the portability of the concept and how we measure it in multi-party and multilingual contexts like in Canada. Most recently, this conversation has really focused, and I'm saying this conversation between the ANES and the CES, has focused on the nature and presence of polarization. And so some of the trends that Nick was highlighting that we can understand through the use of the ANES, we also can see in the Canadian context. And it's almost always understood in relation to, is it bigger, is it smaller than the US? Is it bigger or smaller than what we're seeing in the ANES data? And to give you a sense of what this looks like, this is some work that Dick Johnston just published that looks at the dispersion of party ratings, feeling thermometers towards the party that were presented by Nick in the US context. So these are just, the lines should be just understood as they get bigger, the parties are getting evaluated with a greater difference. So the same trends that Nick demonstrated where the parties are evaluated better when they're your party, and that declining evaluation of the party is what you're seeing here. So the distance between those two ratings is increasing over time and across all of the parties in the Canadian context. So we have a multi-party system with the NDP, the Liberals and Conservatives, in the 90s, the Reform, and then we often separate out Quebec, given the unique party structure there. So we're seeing these trends in partisan affective polarization in the Canadian context that are not always as big as what we're observing in the ANES data. And I think that's one of the ways in which we interpret a lot of our findings in the Canadian context is that we're not, and I'll use this carefully, not quite as bad as the US is usually how it's interpreted. And this is just one example of the ways in which that it gets highlighted. So this is an article by Anthony Kevins and Stuart Soroka, a former faculty member here in the communications department, who's looking at the partisan sorting in the Canadian context. So a lot of those processes that Nick again was talking about in his presentation, and in the abstract, this comparison is made explicit. So results suggest that Canada has experienced a surge in partisan sorting that is comparable to that in the US. It's always our benchmark, and that benchmark is always based on the NES studies. In recent elections, we've also been innovating in lots of ways in the types of questions that we're asking, and a lot of these echo the concerns that are going on in the US political behavior field. So we've increasingly added measures of expressive partisanship, subjective associations with party labels, so some of the work that Lily Mason is doing, a lot of interest in quasi-behavioral consequences of party cues for the willingness to talk about politics, so behavioral measures of polarization, as well as going back to some of the classic open-ended questions about parties and what electors think about parties. And I'll give you an example of research that I'm doing on that end. Am I doing that time? And I also wanted to do a shout out here because in the next Canadian election study, which will hopefully not be this year, we also are adding a new battery of questions that will be in the 2024 ANES battery as well through collaboration between the two research teams, looking at candidate misbehavior and party labels and how candidate misbehavior, especially criminality, might be interpreted by electors in terms of their attitudes towards the party system. So I'm going to give you an example from some of my own research about these open-ended party label gut reactions to give you a sense of what polarization looks like in the Canadian context and see if it echoes with the reading of the context in the US. So in 2019, we asked people to give us their first things that come to mind when they were given a party label. The party label was randomly assigned, so people got either an out party or their own in party they identified with, and then they had up to 6 open-ended questions that they could give us. This is a highlight, granted not a very deliberate one, but one where I'm going to highlight some of the types of ways in which people talk about their own in-party versus the way in which they talk about their out-party. So when you ask liberals about other liberals, they talk about the party being balanced, continuity, corruption, which if you know the history of the Liberal Party is not inaccurate, fair, good, hardworking, centrist, open, progressive, etc. When you ask liberals about conservatives, they're against everything good. They're anti-feminist, they're big business, they're bullies, backwards, racist, homophobic, dangerous, etc. And you get the same type of dynamic coming up when you ask conservatives about conservatives, as well as conservatives about liberals. So conservatives will tell you that other conservatives are about balanced budgets, they're fiscally conservative, they have moral values, it's about freedom, less government, less taxes. And they think liberals are bad, big spenders, corrupt. So you get a little bit of agreement there. Dishonest, fake, hypocrites, lies, fiscally irresponsible, full of shit, idiots, liars, sleazy, and stupid. So this is some of the stuff we're getting in our most recent Canadian elections, which I think echo a lot of our interpretation of the processes of effective polarization going on in the US. And these are particularly negatively toned for people who are high on expressive partisanship. So people who have a strong social identity connected to their own party are particularly likely to give these really hostile, very high negative and positive tone responses, which is not surprising, but I think it speaks to a lot of the same processes that we're seeing in the US. So I want to conclude by pulling out a quote from Elizabeth Gidengo, who is a longtime co-PI on the Canadian election studies. And in 1994, she produced a retrospective on the first quarter century of the CES. And it goes back to this idea of surveys being held by caretakers in the research community that provide them for the social science community. So she says surveys are reusable commodities. The cost per eventual user is much lower and declines as more students and researchers engage in secondary analyses of these data sets. I think this is clearly evident with the ANES. It's clearly evident with the CES. And I think the ways in which you can see the ANES iterations in lots of national election studies around the world makes this very clear. I would add to her quote that surveys are very expensive and hard to fund reusable commodities when they're well done, because there's lots of bad, cheap surveys out there. So having high quality survey data in the US, but also data that's comparable in other countries is really a resource for the research community. And then I would add that cost per eventual user is much lower and declines as more students and researchers engage in secondary analysis. And the impact of these surveys is compounded when those surveys are coordinated across countries and contexts, and we can add across time. So I hope that I've convinced you that, at least in the context of the Canadian elections study, there's been lots of links from its founding with the ANES. A lot of the themes and questions that we've asked over time reflect what's going on in the ANES, and also sometimes challenge the ways in which the ANES has been asking those questions to push American researchers to think about the substance of the concepts that are really at the heart of our explanations. So with that, I'll thank you. All of our data is publicly available, so we abide by those open science practices that Nick mentioned. So I would encourage you, if you want to have additional countries to analyze the ANES against, that the Canadian election study makes a great resource for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick and Allison, if you wouldn't mind come sitting up here. So we're going to do questions starting with this mic up here. So if you have a question, please come on up here. If you would prefer to remain seated, I am happy to bring a microphone to you. So just make eye contact with me somehow. And we have about 25 minutes, so thank you, please.
Thanks for your wonderful presentations. I'm interested if you can sort from your data, maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, age as a factor in all that you presented, young people versus older people.
I see. You're are you one of those that hopes that the kids are going to save us? Is that?
I thought we were supposed to save the kids.
Yeah, that's the other point of view. We have looked at age, and actually, I don't know if this will make you happy or sad, that the polarization that we see is just as big among younger groups as it is among older groups in the United States. We don't see much less polarization among young people than we see among older generations. Sometimes we get our hopes up about that when we see a particular study, but if you looked at those data over time, you wouldn't, if you just looked at the young people or the old people, you'd see the same pattern for what it's worth. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sheila Murphy. I'm really glad that somebody is still using the affective items that Bob Zients came up with, and with Don Kinder, and they're actually, I worked with both of them in 1980, and I'm delighted they're still being used. But I'm hoping the women are going to save us. And I would argue, and I'm here to argue that, yes, I agree with your data, and you did compellingly show that this racial resentment is pulling party polarization. But what about post-Roe being overturned? Are you actually going to see a disassociation between party ID for women in this upcoming election? Fingers crossed.
Oh, thank you, Sheila. Another excellent question with, I'm afraid, maybe perhaps somewhat depressing answer. And that is that while we do see very powerful dynamics going on in the current moment around gender, and I believe personally that the overturning of Roe will be mobilizing among voters, especially vulnerable women who normally don't vote in places that they normally don't vote in, from states that are particularly restrictive. The gender gap is significant in the United States in terms of party and voting behavior, but it is not dramatically larger than it used to be, surprisingly enough. And so it is not, in my impression or my belief, that that women per se as a group will be saving the democratic system we have here in the United States. It's worth remembering that on those abortion questions that we've been asking since the 1980s in almost the same way, and if those of you who've used those items might not be terribly happy with the particular way we asked the abortion item, but it is consistent. And when we ask it that way, we find a gender gap. But it's important to remember that there are many Democratic men who are pro-choice, who are who are strongly and passionately pro-choice, who care about that issue. And without them and their support for that movement, it's hard to imagine that we would have had Roe in the first place. And they're just as affected in many ways and perceive themselves to be just as affected by the overturning of Roe. So this is really it's not just a gender-based movement. Yeah, as I'm sure you know.
But what about, I was hoping that Republican women would become more disassociated on the abortion issue and therefore perhaps save us. That's not going to happen. A little. Okay.
A little. And the elections are close because of that. If that were true, I think our polls right now, it would probably make it easier for me to join my friends in the commercial political polling industry and make a prediction about what's going to happen. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Linda Wade for the University of Chicago, but I trained at ISR. I have questions about the diversity of the American population and a little tweaks I'm sure you've done in your analyses. But on the race issue, is it just Blacks versus everybody else? Because the population's become much more diverse. The Black population isn't really growing proportionately. The Hispanic population is. The other Black and brown people, as a close colleague calls them, are much. So that's one. And two, the Christian, I think, should be divided into conservative Christian and everybody else. And on the everybody else, that no religions have to be unique in some way. So I'd like to see those broken down more.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is why I said, speaking to this audience, you would not be convinced. I would need to do much more to convince you of this. And these are two really important reasons why. So first of all, I simplified in my slides and showed you only African-American changes as a proportion of the parties. And then, I also didn't break down religion in the way that you wanted to, in the way that I also agree with it needs to be done. And those do complicate the picture in very interesting ways. I'm sure if you read the newspaper each day, it's evident that at least journalists believe that non-whites, especially Latino Americans, are moving away from the Democratic Party, and that there might be a racial realignment, by which they mean the opposite of what I mean here. So I can't really answer in a short period of time all of the thoughts I have in reaction to your question. But let me just associate myself with your remarks. The picture does get more complicated if you do the things you would like to do, and that's the right thing to do. If I might, though, I wonder if maybe I could put Allison on the spot and ask her, since obviously the demographics of Canada are very different than here, if you see anything like that. Have you looked at those sorts of things in answer to this question?
So the dominance of race in how we define diversity in the Canadian context is very different. We didn't actually ask us explicit racial question until the 2019 Canadian election study. It was, yes, we do. Ethnic origin ancestry questions, which don't map very well onto racial divides. And so a lot of what's happened in the recent years is thinking about the ways in which racial identity might be different from immigration ancestry types of questions. And we do see a longstanding affiliation of immigrant groups with the Liberal Party, but by adding in race, you see a much stronger association with the Social Democratic NDP. And so you get some of these sorts of dynamics in the Canadian context as well. But it's part of the challenge of having longstanding questions and surveys. And so you were talking about the advantage of having questions that are asked the same way over long periods of time, that are maybe not perfect, but they're good enough. One of the things that we've had real challenges around is thinking about how we measure sociodemographics and how we change those questions over time to reflect the sort of changing diversity of the ways in which people identify in terms of racial identity, but also gender identity.
Very interesting presentations. I'd like to follow up on exactly that last point and perhaps the advantage of having these similar studies across the two countries. And back to still not being convinced, Nick, it seems like we're seeing exactly the same kind of polarization happening in Canada that we're seeing in the US. And it seemed to kind of leap off the page to me of well, wait, you just told us that the US was being driven by things happening with race, and I don't think in Canada that's likely to be the explanation. So don't we have a kind of a challenge just coming from across the border here to your story?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question for all of us. And I do think that now that we have really high quality data and we're starting to develop time series in other countries and other democracies, that we're really going to be able for the first time to answer that question head on. I'm not ready to give up on the idea that race matters both here and in Canada. And I didn't hear Allison exactly say that, actually. There are different definitions of what racial and ethnic differences are there and how they overlap with politics. But what I heard her say is that it's quite possible that ethnicity in some psychological form that's similar to the way race operates in American politics could also be dividing Canadian politics, and that we need more data and a longer time series to figure it out. So I think I'll just agree with you very much, David, and I know that it's incumbent on me, especially with observational data like this, where causal mechanisms are really hard to identify. And even though we have a beautiful history and a beautiful historical trend, we don't know exactly what came first. We can only show you the time series. And when we show you the time series, it looks like changes, fairly incremental secular changes over time in many of these dimensions. So.
That question kind of stole my thunder a little bit. But I'll pose this to both of you, and maybe I'll frame it a little
That's
differently.
what you get, Josh, for going after a former director of the
Right,
institute.
exactly. But if we go back a little bit in terms of this funnel of causality, to borrow from the American voter, and again, I'll pose this to both of you, although Nick and I have been going to the same talks for 30 years.
Yeah.
We're also celebrating the 75th anniversary of the authoritarian personality, so the whole Berkeley School approach, and where they try to get to these kind of psychological dynamics. And we had Stanley Feldman spoke here last couple of years. So does something like authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, is this going to help us? Or is the fact that we're seeing these sorts of dynamics in a pretty transnational sense, not just Canada, but presumably Western Europe as well, not get us any closer to answering that sort of question?
Yeah. Well, let me just say that Josh and I were both trained at UCLA by political psychologists there, including Sedanius and Dave Sears and Chantal Iyer and others. And I will just say something I know Josh knows, but maybe others in the room don't know, which is that Sedanius believed that racial resentment was a specific example of his theory of social dominance, and he could predict any outcome in the United States that also would show evidence of the power of racial resentment based on his own broader theory, which he tested in many other places. So I'm not sure that there's any way to answer your question honestly, except to say, if Jim's right, then it doesn't matter. He would say he was righter, but because he would explain more phenomena. You remember Jim, I'm sure.
We could say right now. Why now? Right? These dynamics from Adorno et al. Go back 75 years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if that's your question, I think my own view is that we thought the civil rights movement may have ended politically. Its consequences may have ended maybe in the 60s or the early 70s, but they didn't. The sorting that was triggered by the civil rights movement in the U.S. persists incrementally and secularly through to the early aughts, setting the table for a politician like Donald Trump to be successful in 2016 where he couldn't have been before because the party system had adjusted and sorted to that extent. Donald Trump's politics did not change in 2016. They had existed in exactly the same form and making the same kinds of public statements, very high on social dominance orientation, I'm sure, if he would take Jim's battery. And that had been true since the 1980s, and he had been running for one form of office or another, and he had been failing. Pat Buchanan and others. So I would say that the parties shifted around these authoritarian personalities and made it possible for them to win, barely, but win they have. And this is also true in other places.
Yeah, and I maybe I would just add in there, in the Canadian context, I think one of the things that you see in recent elections is that an elite consensus has really broken down, allowing some of the types of discourse to become much more mainstream that you see in the US as well. And so that interaction between what's going on in the political institutions with political actors really echoes itself when this sort of sorting happens on the ground as well. And so I think that sort of explanation is not necessarily particular to the US and some of the dynamics that we're seeing here.
Hi, I'm Professor Sylvia Pedraza here at the University of Michigan. And thank you very much for your presentations. They're excellent. I realized that for the sake of simplicity and brevity, that you only brought Black Americans into the presentation. And as Professor Linda Waite pointed out, we are an increasingly diverse society. I think what worries me is actually that when that increasing diversity, when we make an effort to include it, so we bring Asians, Hispanics, and so on into the analysis, that most of the time we leave the category of Hispanic or Latino undifferentiated. And actually, it is a very heterogeneous category. And if you leave them as a block, Hispanic or Latino, what you're really measuring is the very, very, very large group of Mexicans. And I think particularly with respect to political attitudes, that there really is an enormous difference between some groups that fairly consistently vote conservative, Cuban Americans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Colombians, and some groups that rather consistently vote liberal, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, other South Americans. So I wonder if you could try in the analysis in the future to sort of bring in that sort of conservative versus liberal pole, so we have a better picture of what it means to be a Latino in this country.
Thank you, Sylvia. The answer is yes, I would love to do so. And the American National Election Study tries to produce samples large enough and including oversamples that would allow us to look at these individual groups and even subgroups in enough detail that we could really get at the answers to these questions. Getting representative samples of those groups and those subgroups that are large enough to do so with statistical power is very daunting. And we can only do so occasionally, and we haven't done that in the same time series. This is another reason why I often need to simplify. But absolutely, to your point, the Latino community in the U.S. is very diverse politically. And I would just say, and Sylvia, you probably know much more about this than I do, that actually one of the interesting trends in very recent times is that it's not just the Cubans who represent a very tiny fraction of American voters, or the people from Colombia who represent a tiny fraction, but also even among Mexican Americans that we're seeing some of these very interesting dynamics where some are getting peeled off and voting more for the Republican Party than before. This happened between 2016 and 2020. One of my own graduate students is working on this. Why is it that Latinos, the Latinx voters shifted at all after they had an opportunity to listen to Donald Trump talk about immigration and maybe even their ethnic group the way he does? And yet they did move. And so those are important, very important things to study. I'm afraid that these big infrastructure projects don't do as good a job at understanding the dynamics of subgroups that are small in the US. And that's just something that we have to continue and should continue to acknowledge and recognize and strive to fix if we possibly can, which we have from time to time. We have drawn over samples of non-white groups and tried to study those dynamics at any one moment. I don't know if this is the same for you, Allison.
So what the ANES does in terms of sample quality, we can't achieve with the type of funding we have in the Canadian context. And so we've gone with very large samples instead in the last few iterations. So we had almost 35,000 respondents in 2019 and another 20,000 respondents in 2021, particularly so we could look at some of the heterogeneity among the groups with limits in terms of how representative those samples of those groups are. And so that maybe be one area where we contrast in terms of the types of data we collect and the types of questions we can ask. But we can't get those in terms of dynamics. So yeah. It's about what's happening right now with some of those small groups, but not necessarily how they're changing over time.
Yeah, I just will say one last thing. It might be a little bit in the weeds, but not for many people in this audience. Oversamples are fantastic, but they often produce samples with very large design effects. And certainly non-random samples produce samples that where we don't even know what sometimes what the sampling parameters are. And so we would then, that would be outside the bounds at the ANES as long as we're funded by the National Science Foundation. They want us to produce samples with as small design effects as possible, as small errors as possible. And so we don't collect large samples in order to just have any information about groups. We want to make sure that the people we're talking to are representative of their ethnic group or of the nation at large. And therefore we sacrifice the kinds of explorations that Sylvie was mentioning. Not entirely. I don't want to be too pessimistic. Not entirely, and not because we like it, but that's because sometimes statistics get in the way. Power is there whether we like it or not.
I'd like to first set the context for my remarks. I was a graduate student here in the late 60s and the 70s in the American voter days when Campbell Calvers and Miller and Stokes were still here. And I was fascinated by your remark about how people think questions on abortion should be phrased differently today. I wanted to share one thing. We had the same tensions back in the 60s where we already knew some of the questions could be asked better that would allow us to investigate things more thoroughly. And the one thing I wanted to share was it was clear from Converse's remarks he never wanted to change a question, even if there was a better way of asking it. The ability to show things across time was really central to what he wanted to accomplish. I hear that in your remarks today.
Well, that's very reassuring. I've heard that about Warren Miller. I hadn't heard it about Phil, that he also felt the same way. Obviously, I think in order for us to make good on the promise that they wanted to make for the community, that has to be true, that we care a great deal about consistency of measurement over time. That has to be really paramount. Now, of course, as the definition of words change, the nature of questions, the meaning of questions change. And so it's not so easy a solution as just we're going to ask using the same words. And I have countless examples. But I know for many of you who are survey scientists, I feel one of the most fortunate aspects of my job is to sit amongst a board of advisors who are all the best survey scientists in the fields that I care about and fight about exactly this question. Fight tooth and nail for each question and how it's worded and whether we can improve it or whether we have to just keep it the same and just swallow hard and say, even though it's not perfect, we need that new time point because we need to be able to compare to everything that came before. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your support there.
One amendment to that, we got the feeling thermometers introduced, and I'm very glad that they're still here. Thank you.
Thank you. They are very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nick and Allison, for wonderful presentations. And I think our time for this session is up. So thank you.